Talk Radio.
And let's go back to that education story. This one isn't going away. Gavin Williamson ignored Ofqual's advice not to cancel A-level and GCSE exams in England. The chair of the exams watchdog has told MPs. Speaking to the Commons Education Committee this morning, Roger Taylor said it had been a fundamental mistake to believe the public would accept results decided by a computer algorithm. The Education Secretary is said to have taken the decision on March the 18th to cancel exams and use a system of calculated grades without further consultation with Ofqual, we are told. The algorithm saw 40% of A-level students downgraded, with poorer teenagers disproportionately hit. Let's speak with Justine Greening, former Education Secretary. Justine Greening, afternoon to you. This is quite a damning comment on the current Education Secretary.
Well, I think perhaps in a way what's most damning is what actually happened on the ground for students over the summer, when we saw complete chaos in relation to both GCSE and A-level results coming out. I think what people really want now is perhaps a little less finger pointing around the system and a bit more focus on how we can actually get young people's education back on track. I think parents are probably, and students, just fed up of the politics and really just want a system put in place and a plan put in place to enable them to catch up on their education and then get on with looking at what opportunities they can have once they finish their studies and their exams and when they get out into the workplace.
And of course, nobody wants to see a repeat of what we did see. And I have a sympathy, and I'm not meant to say this, Justine, as a journalist. I have a sympathy with you guys and politicians. And if you're a Secretary of State, there's nothing you could, of course, the worst thing you can do is function by committee. You've got to, at some point, take a decision. So I understand that this could have gone backwards and forwards for a bit, and eventually Mr. Williamson would have had to have made that decision. But, I mean, retrospectively, let's just cut to the chase. Was that the wrong decision?
Well, clearly what happened over the summer was not good. I mean, you had thousands of young people not knowing what their grades were and then getting the wrong grades. I think it's clear to me that the best solution, was it possible, and you'd have to have detailed advice to know, would have simply been to do socially distanced exams if you could have. But I think what it underlines anyway, and maybe what employers and increasingly universities know anyway, is that these results are anyhow a very narrow measure of a young person's potential. And I think perhaps if there's one thing the government now should be really looking at much more strategically, it's how can we get a better assessment of a young person's potential coming out of the education system that goes beyond a narrow exam grade that they achieve on a particular day, that is always going to be, to some extent, a reflector of their background and where they've come from, rather than a reflector of where they can get to and their potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could all agree with that there are clearly, there's work needs to be done in order to make the whole process slightly fairer. And I guess whatever system you put in place, there will always be that debate that what if you did it this way, you would address that group over there in a more proportionate manner, etc. And that debate could go on. But I mean, in terms of where we were left with the sort of educational carnage that this saw, would it have not just been easier in the beginning to not cancel the A-levels? And bearing in mind, if social distancing was the issue, it's probably the one area in life that social distancing was already a thing before we'd even heard of the word. So they should have gone ahead, shouldn't they?
I think back in April I was saying that really the remote education that young people are getting could have been dramatically improved if we'd have used the community spaces that were available. There were libraries and community halls lying unused, businesses with offices and conference halls entirely unused. I think there was logistical space there in order to be able to do lessons and, as you say, potentially have exams, which would have been far less disruptive. I do think it's hard for any Secretary of State having to take decisions, but clearly what we do need at some point is to learn from the mess that we saw unfold over the summer, because actually, as we already know, decisions will need to be taken for next year's exams. I think the point I'm making in addition to this, though, is that actually this is a chance to look more fundamentally at the system and really challenge ourselves to say, if we're going to have an education system in this country that helps us level up, not down, and we saw leveling down over the last few months, then we have to think more broadly about the fact that education is more than just exams. It's much wider than that. And yet actually traditionally we continue to have this exceptionally narrow focus on young people's potential. Many universities are looking at what's called contextualized admissions. So they look beyond the grades. They've had to do that this year anyway. What I'm saying is it's not a bad thing to now have employers and universities and schools think beyond exams to this wider person that they have to develop. Because when you talk to the businesses that I do through the work on the Social Mobility Pledge, they're all saying that actually the thing that marks out successful employees of the future isn't their exam grades so much. It's much more whether they can work in a team, their resilience, their motivation, all the other stuff. And yet actually when you think about what we're teaching young people in schools and colleges, it's not so much that. And at some stage we do have to address this big gap between what employers want from a successful employee and leader of the future versus what we're actually teaching our young people in school.
When you were education secretary, what were Ofqual like to deal with? Were these a reasonable bunch of people, as you remember?
I think they were one of a number of almost arm's length agencies that you dealt with as a Secretary of State. And clearly the exam system had been in place for many, many years. It was tried and tested. There are a number of examples within that almost provided some necessary challenge and debate within the system. I think what no one expected reasonably is to have to work without exams at all. And that was the challenge that everybody confronted back in March.
They said have the exams.
And clearly it was incredibly hard for them all.
And Ofqual said, let's have the exams. The Education Secretary said, let's not have the exam. And this is the information we've only found out this morning. Can you imagine if you were in that job that you would have ignored their advice?
Oh, I was pretty forensic about taking on advice and getting to the bottom of it. I think the decision on exams probably would have been one of the most important ones I would have taken during my time as a Secretary of State for Education. It had to be taken somewhat quickly, but perhaps by comparison to shutting down the school system more widely, it wasn't one that needed to be taken instantly, and it could have been reflected on more carefully. I think only time and perhaps a more independent inquiry will really get to the bottom of how the decision was made, what the input into that of Ofqual was, and then how Gavin Williamson as Secretary of State for Education actually went through the process of taking that decision. They were very, very tough decisions. I think the key is to now learn from them, but perhaps most importantly, I would argue, get education back on track. I mean, what parents want to see and what students want to see is a proper catch-up plan. They want to make sure that this lack of education they've had over the last few months doesn't harm their future.
As a former minister in a senior capacity, Justine Greening, well, just a final point, how were you judging his performance at that time? You must have looked back and thought, there but for the grace of God, and thank goodness I don't sit in that panelled room any longer. What a fine time to have legged it from Westminster, etc. I can imagine all those thoughts going through, but you must have thought, hang on a second, I'm smelling something a little iffy here. This isn't going particularly well. Did you spot the carnage coming down the tracks in the direction of Gavin Williamson?
I was always worried about the fact that schools had simply shut and then been left to get on with somehow educating children and young people remotely, because that just seemed a recipe for levelling down and getting different results de facto. Unless you're actually understanding what the risks are, you are going to get different results when you take that decision. And I think perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that the exams result chaos that we then saw followed on from all of that. Again, from my perspective, I see this moment as a moment to almost reinvent how we look at education in this country and how you put in place a plan for levelling up through education. If you're not going to take this opportunity now, when COVID-19 has made all those education inequality gaps get even wider, If it doesn't matter now, when does it? And I think people don't want to go back to normal. I think they do want to see a different version of this country. And I think at the heart of getting that in the long term is a proper leveled up plan for education. And that is more about just opening schools. And it's more than just saying that in the short term, we might have some personalised tuition for some young people who've been most disadvantaged. It's a much more profound question for the education system, not just in England, but across the whole of Britain. That's the opportunity to grasp, because I think if we really can use this moment to start levelling up, then actually it can be a time when things get a lot better. But unless we take that opportunity, it'll be a time when, yes, the risk is we see far more levelling down, the exact opposite of what Boris Johnson's administration wants to do.
Would it also be a good time to look at how we appoint education secretaries?
Well, I think part of this is having the right team in place. And from my perspective, I remember going into that role saying it was the best job in government. I mean, it literally is, for me, at the heart of any country's success. Its biggest asset is its people, and this is how you make sure they can fulfill their potential. I think if Boris Johnson is going to have another reshuffle, he really needs someone who is passionate about this role, but crucially who can work with teachers and work on the ground with different communities that face very, very different challenges on education. One of the main projects I put in place when I was at education were things called opportunity areas, which were a chance to work inside schools on school improvement, but marry that up with work outside schools with communities and businesses. The 12 opportunities we put in place are really starting to see 3 years later significant improvements. So the ones in Yorkshire, for example, Bradford, has seen a rate of improvement in English, reading, writing and maths that is 16% better than the national average. I think these more bespoke programs like opportunity areas could really be a route to quickly improving results and quickly levelling up in communities that most need it. And I think what ministers need to do, whoever they are, is look at solutions and what already works and then turbocharge and scale that up as fast as they can.
Should it be, just a very final point, should it be a former teacher that takes those kind of roles?
I don't think it has to be. I think it's about somebody who is willing to work with the teaching profession, but actually has a scale of ambition for change on education and levelling up that can match that the rest of the country has. And I think the answers also lie in Treasury. Rishi Sunak, Chancellor, has put a lot of money into protecting jobs. He now needs to look very carefully at what it's going to take. He used those words, whatever it takes, to protect children's futures and investment in education. It's about not just protecting the economy today, it's about putting in place the way that we can protect opportunity in the economy tomorrow. And that actually starts with education. And I hope that when he finally gets to his budget in November, that education and education investment and the plans on levelling up will be a core part of that budget that he announces.
Justine Greening, thank you. Good to have you with us. Former Education Secretary, former Conservative MP